I still remember the way Sandra looked at me when we first met, like I was the only man in the room. I was working as a junior accountant then, barely earning enough to keep my fridge stocked, but that didn't matter to her, or so I thought. She had this infectious energy, the kind that lit up every corner of a room. I fell hard and fast, certain I'd found my partner for life. We were the definition of us against the world, at the beginning. I didn't have much, but I gave her everything I could. My time, my devotion, my dreams for a better future. Sandra, for her part, supported me in her own way. She was always talking about how we'd make it together, how one day we'd rise above the struggles. Those words kept me going through long hours and sleepless nights. When we got married, it wasn't a grand affair, just a small ceremony at the local church with close friends and family. But it was perfect. She held my hand so tightly, as if to say, "I'm with you no matter what." And I believed her. Oh, how I believed her. We started small, a modest two-bedroom apartment, hand-me-down furniture, and a shared bank account that barely made it through the month. But none of that mattered because we had each other. At least, that's what I told myself every time I skipped lunch to save a little extra for her dreams. Sandra had big ambitions. She wanted a life of luxury, the kind she'd seen in magazines. "Victor," she would say, "one day, I'll host parties in a house so grand people will talk about it for years." I'd laugh and tell her we'd get there, though I wasn't sure how. All I knew was that I would work myself to the bone to give her the life she wanted. And I did. I took extra shifts, picked up freelance work, and even sold off the car my father left me when times got tight. Sandra, on the other hand, began polishing her social skills. She charmed everyone she met, climbing her way into social circles far above our pay grade. I thought she was doing it for us, for our future. I was wrong. Looking back, there were signs, small ones at first. The way she started spending more time out with her new friends, how she brushed off my attempts to talk about our dreams, or the way her laughter seemed forced when I told her about my day. But I ignored it. I wanted to believe we were still the same couple who used to dream of better days while sitting on our secondhand couch, eating noodles straight from the pot. The breaking point, though, was the renovation. Sandra convinced me that we needed to upgrade our home to match our ambitions. I didn't think we could afford it, but she was persuasive. "It's an investment, Victor," she said. "You'll see." So, I took out a loan, a hefty one. Our modest home turned into something out of a lifestyle magazine. Chandeliers, marble countertops, imported rugs. All things Sandra insisted were necessities. The house was stunning, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it no longer felt like home. Sandra, on the other hand, seemed to thrive. She hosted her first party shortly after the renovations were complete, and from the way she floated around the room, you'd think she'd been born into wealth. But even then, I didn't question her loyalty. I didn't question her love for me. I should have, because that was the beginning of the end. I just didn't know it yet. You know, when people say love is blind, they forget to mention it's also deaf and dumb. I didn't hear the whispers behind my back, the snickers when Sandra introduced me as her husband to her new friends. I didn't see the cracks forming in the foundation of our marriage because I was too busy patching the walls of our lives with hard work and sacrifice. After the renovations, the debt started to weigh on me like a boulder tied to my ankles. I had a steady job, sure, but it wasn't enough to keep up with the lifestyle Sandra had built for herself, or rather, for the image of herself she wanted to project. The lavish dinners, the designer outfits, the endless parties, those weren't cheap. I didn't complain. Instead, I picked up extra freelance gigs and worked late into the night. She'd often say, "Victor, you're such a hard-working man." But her tone felt hollow, like she was talking about a robot that served her rather than a husband who loved her. Still, I smiled and told her it was all for us. But deep down, I was starting to feel like a shadow in my own home. The thing is, when you're drowning, you don't notice how tired you are until you're about to sink. One night, I came home after an exhausting day, only to find Sandra hosting another impromptu gathering. The house was filled with people I didn't recognize, laughing, drinking, clinking their glasses as if they'd conquered the world. Sandra was at the center of it all, wearing a dress I'd never seen before, looking every bit like the queen of her little kingdom. When she spotted me, Her smile faltered for just a moment before she came over. "Victor, you're home? Why didn't you tell me you'd be late?" she asked, her tone light but her eyes warning me not to embarrass her in front of her guests. I just nodded and mumbled something about work. She didn't ask any more questions. Later that night, as I sat alone in our bedroom, I realized something had shifted. Sandra didn't see me anymore. I was just a name on a bank account, a provider for her ever-growing appetite for status. I thought about confronting her, but what would I even say? I didn't have proof of anything, just a gut feeling that the woman I loved was slipping away. The turning point came a few weeks later. I had stayed up late working on a side project when I overheard Sandra talking on the phone in the living room. "Victor doesn't understand ambition," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "He's comfortable being mediocre. I can't live like this forever." Those words cut deeper than any knife could. I wanted to burst into the room, demand an explanation, but I didn't. Instead, I sat there in the dark, replaying her words in my head. Mediocre. Was that what she thought of me after everything I'd done? That night, I decided I couldn't keep running on this treadmill of sacrifice while Sandra kept moving the goalposts. I needed to protect myself, but I wasn't ready to give up on our marriage just yet. So, I started making quiet changes. I opened a separate bank account and began funneling small amounts of money into it. I also started tracking our joint account more closely, noting Sandra's spending habits. I even started a small business on the side. Nothing big, just enough to give me some breathing room. Sandra never noticed. She was too busy with her parties and new friends. But what hurt the most wasn't her neglect. It was how little she seemed to care about the man she once promised to love and cherish. Every time she laughed a little too hard at someone else's joke or brushed off my attempts to connect, it felt like another brick in the wall she was building between us. I kept telling myself it was just a rough patch, that we'd find our way back to each other eventually. But the truth was, Sandra wasn't looking back. She was already moving forward, and I was just the dead weight she hadn't figured out how to cut loose. That night is etched into my memory, not because it hurt, it did, but because it showed me exactly where I stood in Sandra's life. She had planned this party for weeks, hyping it up as the event of the season. I thought it was just another one of her gatherings to show off our home, but I couldn't have been more wrong. When I arrived home that evening, the house was transformed. Chandeliers sparkled, music played softly in the background, and expensive wine flowed like water. Sandra had spared no expense. Her friends were there, all dressed to the nines, and in the middle of it all was Alex, the man I had come to recognize as a constant presence at these gatherings. I stood at the doorway, holding a small box in my hand. It was a gift, a diamond bracelet I'd saved up for months to buy. I thought it would remind her of the love we shared, something tangible to pull her back to the woman I fell in love with. When Sandra saw me, she didn't rush over like a loving wife. She barely acknowledged me, giving a weak smile before turning back to her conversation with Alex. I stood there, feeling like an intruder in my own home. One of her friends noticed me and said loudly, "Oh, look, Sandra's husband is here." The way she said it made my skin crawl, like I was some relic Sandra kept around for show. Sandra finally turned toward me, and her expression was a mix of annoyance and forced politeness. "Victor, you're late," she said, her voice carrying an edge. I tried to explain that I'd been working late, but she cut me off. "You should have told me. You know how important tonight is." I held out the gift box, hoping it would soften her mood. "This is for you," I said quietly. She opened it, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a spark of the woman I once knew. But then she laughed, a short, cruel laugh. "A bracelet," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Victor, this is why you'll never understand me." Her words hung in the air like a slap. The room fell silent, and all eyes were on us. Sandra didn't stop there. She turned to her friends and added, "You see, Victor's idea of ambition is working late to buy trinkets like this. Alex, on the other hand, knows what it means to live." Alex smirked, and the others laughed. I stood there, frozen, feeling the weight of their mockery. Sandra wasn't done yet. She pulled off her wedding ring and held it up for everyone to see. "This," she said, gesturing to the ring, "this is just a symbol. It doesn't mean anything if the person who gave it to you doesn't grow with you." and then she threw it at me. It landed at my feet, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. The laughter around me grew louder, and I could feel their eyes boring into me, judging me. I looked at Sandra, hoping for some sign of remorse, but there was none. She was basking in their approval, as if humiliating me was some kind of twisted accomplishment. I bent down, picked up the ring, and put it in my pocket. My hand shook, but I didn't say a word. What was there to say? The woman I loved had turned me into a spectacle, and I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing me break. As I turned to leave, I heard Alex say, "Don't worry, Sandra. Some men are meant to build foundations so others can live in the penthouse." The laughter that followed was the final nail in the coffin. I walked out of that house, feeling like I had left behind more than just a party. I had left behind my dignity, my trust, and the last shred of love I had for Sandra. But as I stood outside, the cold air hitting my face, something shifted inside me. I wasn't just humiliated. I was done. Done with her games, her lies, her cruelty. And in that moment, I made a vow to myself. This wasn't over. When I stepped out of that house, leaving behind the laughter, the humiliation, and Sandra's cruelty, I didn't feel defeated. I felt clear. For the first time in years, the fog of love and loyalty that had clouded my judgment lifted, and I saw things for what they truly were. Sandra hadn't just humiliated me. She had erased me, reduced me to a joke in front of strangers, her lover, and her so-called friends. I drove aimlessly that night, the ring she had thrown at me still in my pocket. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I should have been crying, screaming, something, but instead, I was calm. Too calm. I parked near an empty park and sat there in the silence, staring at the city lights in the distance. My mind played back every moment of our marriage. The promises we'd made, the sacrifices I'd endured, and the slow, steady erosion of the woman I thought I knew. How did it get this bad? I whispered to myself, and then I realized it didn't just get bad. It had been bad for a long time. I'd been blind, making excuses for her actions, convincing myself that things would improve. But tonight, Sandra had made one thing abundantly clear. She didn't see me as a partner. I wasn't even a person to her. I was a stepping stone, a means to an end. It was time to stop being the victim. I opened my phone and logged into our joint bank account. I'd always been the one managing our finances. Sandra was too busy entertaining her high society friends to care about the details. The account balance stared back at me, a mix of savings, investments, and the remnants of my endless overtime hours. I tapped into a secondary account I'd opened years ago, an account Sandra didn't know about. At the time, I'd created it as a safety net, just in case we ever needed it. I never imagined it would become my lifeline. One by one, I began transferring funds. Not everything, just enough to leave her a fraction of what we built together. Enough to remind her of what she'd lost, but not enough for her to maintain the life she so desperately craved. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, still protecting her even after what she'd done. But this wasn't about revenge. It was about survival, my survival. Once the transfers were complete, I started digging deeper. I accessed our shared email account and found receipts for extravagant purchases I hadn't approved. Designer clothes, expensive jewelry, and worst of all, payments to Alex. She'd been funneling money into his failing business, propping him up with the sweat of my labor. I forwarded those emails to myself, creating a folder labeled Evidence. I didn't know what I'd do with it yet, but having it felt like taking back some of the power she had stolen from me. By the time the sun began to rise, I had a plan. I wasn't going to confront her in a fit of anger. Sandra would expect that. She'd twist my emotions, play the victim, and make me look like the bad guy. No, I was going to handle this quietly, methodically. First, I'd secure my financial independence. The funds I'd transferred would be enough to start fresh, no matter where I ended up. Second, I'd gather every piece of evidence I could to protect myself from any fallout Sandra might cause. If she wanted to destroy me, she'd have to climb over the mountain of her own lies to do it. And third, I'd wait. Timing was everything. Sandra had built her world on appearances, and the higher she climbed, the harder she'd fall. All I had to do was bide my time and let her bury herself. I sat there in the car, watching the city come to life around me, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of control. I wasn't just reacting to Sandra's betrayal anymore. I was taking charge of my own story. Sandra thought she'd broken me that night, but what she didn't realize was that she had set me free. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I knew what I had to do. Sandra had spent years taking advantage of my love, my loyalty, and my hard work, and I had let her. Not anymore. I started by reviewing everything: bank statements, credit card activity, and investments. Sandra thought she was clever, hiding her little indulgences under household expenses or social obligations. But when you've been managing finances as long as I have, you notice patterns. And hers were glaring. The first thing I did was secure what was left of my savings. She had no idea I'd been siphoning small amounts into my private account for years. It wasn't a lot, just enough for emergencies. But after last night, it felt like a lifeline. I transferred the rest of the joint funds into this account. It wasn't theft. I earned every penny in that account, and I wasn't going to let her or her lover, Alex, use it to fund their fantasies. Next, I froze the credit cards. Sandra loved those cards, loved the freedom they gave her to spend without consequence. I imagined her trying to buy another designer dress or a bottle of expensive wine, only to have the transaction declined. The thought brought a small, grim smile to my face. But I didn't stop there. I knew Sandra's next move would be to call the bank or try to access our joint investments. That's why I contacted the financial institution first, explaining that there were discrepancies and potential fraud tied to the account. It wasn't a lie. She had been funneling money to Alex under the guise of business investments. The bank agreed to temporarily freeze the account pending investigation. By mid-morning, I had done what Sandra never thought I could do. I'd taken control. While I worked, I thought about the conversations I'd overheard between Sandra and Alex. They thought they were untouchable, that I was too weak to fight back. Sandra called me a nobody, a man with no ambition. But ambition doesn't always look like parties and flashy cars. Sometimes it looks like resilience, like quietly preparing for the day when you'll need to protect yourself. That day had arrived. It wasn't just about the money. This was about reclaiming my dignity. Sandra had used me, humiliated me, and discarded me in front of her friends. She'd called me mediocre, a stepping stone for her dreams. What she didn't realize was that I had been the foundation she built her life on. And without me, that foundation would crumble. Later that day, I decided to take it a step further. I had been keeping tabs on Alex, nothing obsessive, just enough to know who he was and what he was about. He was flashy, arrogant, and drowning in debt. Sandra didn't see it, but I did. The man was a con artist, stringing her along while using her for money and status. I made a few anonymous calls to some of Alex's creditors. Turns out, he owed a lot more than Sandra knew. I didn't say much, just hinted that he might have access to hidden funds through a third party. The calls didn't take long, but they set the wheels in motion. By the end of the week, Alex would be facing financial scrutiny he couldn't escape. I also left a breadcrumb trail for Sandra. I placed a few forged documents in a folder on our shared computer, suggesting that Alex had been using her name to secure loans. It wasn't entirely false. He was the type to do something like that, but the documents would push her to question him. If I knew Sandra, and I did, her pride wouldn't let her stay with someone who made her look like a fool. As I wrapped up my preparations, I felt a strange sense of calm. This wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. Sandra had spent years taking from me, emotionally and financially, and it was time for her to face the consequences of her actions. When I finally sat down that evening, I opened my wallet and pulled out her wedding ring. I stared at it for a long time, turning it over in my hand. Once, it had been a symbol of love and partnership. Now, it was just a piece of metal. I placed it on the table and left it there. It wasn't my burden to carry anymore. I don't know what I expected when I walked back into the house the next morning, but I knew it wasn't going to be pretty. The place was still in disarray from the party the night before. Half-empty glasses littered every surface. The floor was sticky with spilled wine, and a faint smell of cigarette smoke lingered in the air. Sandra was sitting on the couch, still wearing the dress from the party, her makeup smeared, and her hair in disarray. Alex was beside her, scrolling through his phone like he didn't have a care in the world. A few of her friends were still there too, slumped over in chairs or nursing hangovers. The sight of them made my stomach turn. As I stepped into the room, Sandra looked up, her eyes narrowing. "What are you doing here?" she snapped. It was an odd question, considering this was my house. But I wasn't in the mood to argue semantics. I set my briefcase down on the coffee table and looked around the room, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make them uncomfortable. "We need to talk," I said finally, my voice steady but firm. Sandra rolled her eyes. "Victor, if this is about last night, just save it. You embarrassed yourself, not me." I ignored her comment and opened my briefcase, pulling out a folder. I placed it on the table and slid it toward her. "You might want to take a look at this." She hesitated, but her curiosity got the better of her. She opened the folder and started flipping through the documents. I watched as her expression shifted from annoyance to confusion and finally to panic. What is this?" she stammered. "It's a detailed account of every dollar you funneled from our joint account into Alex's so-called business," I said, keeping my tone neutral, "along with evidence of his other debts and the creditors who are now looking for him. I thought you deserved to know what your partner has been up to." Alex sat up straighter, his face darkening. "What the hell are you talking about?" "Oh, don't play dumb," I said, turning to him. "You've been using Sandra as your personal ATM, and now your creditors are closing in. I'm sure they'd love to hear how you've been living large on someone else's dime." Sandra's hands trembled as she flipped through the documents. You did this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, Sandra," I said calmly. "You did this. I just made sure you couldn't keep doing it with my money." The room erupted into chaos. Sandra rounded on Alex, accusing him of lying to her. Alex tried to defend himself, but the evidence was too damning. Her friends, who had been silent up until now, started murmuring among themselves, clearly uncomfortable. "You think you can just humiliate me like this?" Sandra shouted, turning back to me. Her face was red with anger, and for a moment, I thought she might actually lunge at me. "Humiliate you?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You humiliated me in front of everyone last night. You called me a nobody. You threw your wedding ring at me. And now you want to play the victim?" Sandra opened her mouth to respond, but I held up a hand to stop her. "No, Sandra, you don't get to turn this around on me. You made your choices. You chose to betray me, to lie to me, to steal from me. And now, you're dealing with the consequences." The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Even Alex, who usually had something smug to say, was at a loss for words. I picked up my briefcase and turned to leave, but before I stepped out the door, I looked back at Sandra one last time. "You told me I was a nobody," I said, "but a nobody wouldn't have seen this coming. A nobody wouldn't have protected himself, and a nobody certainly wouldn't have walked away with his dignity intact. Goodbye, Sandra." As I walked out of the house, I heard her screaming at Alex, her voice shrill and full of rage. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. I thought walking out of that house would bring me closure, but it wasn't over. Not yet. Sandra's world had only just begun to unravel. The first sign came 2 days later. I was sipping coffee in a quiet cafe when my phone buzzed. It was a text from an old mutual friend of ours, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. "Have you seen this?" the message read, followed by a link. Curious, I clicked on it, and there it was, photos and videos from the party. Someone had recorded the entire scene. Sandra throwing the ring, Alex laughing, and me walking out without a word. It had gone viral among her social circle, spreading like wildfire. Sandra wasn't the queen of high society anymore. She was the laughingstock. The comments were brutal. People called her ungrateful, shallow, even cruel. Her so-called friends turned on her faster than I expected, mocking her behind her back and cutting ties to protect their own reputations. The very people she had humiliated me for now treated her like a pariah. But the real blow came a week later. Sandra showed up at my workplace. I'll admit, seeing her there caught me off guard. She looked nothing like the confident, glamorous woman I'd known. Her makeup was smudged, her hair was unkempt, and her eyes were swollen from crying. "Victor, please," she said, her voice trembling. "I need to talk to you." I sighed and led her to a quiet corner outside. I wasn't interested in a public spectacle. "What do you want, Sandra?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. She hesitated, wringing her hands. "They're all gone," she said finally. "Alex, my friends, everyone. They won't even answer my calls." I didn't know it would get this bad. I crossed my arms, refusing to let her see any trace of sympathy. "And what does that have to do with me?" "Victor, I made a mistake," she said, her voice breaking. "I see that now. I should have treated you better. I should have valued what we had. Please, I need your help." I almost laughed. "You need my help? After everything you did to me? After you called me a nobody in front of your lover and your friends? Sandra, you didn't just break my heart. You tried to destroy me." Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of pity. But then I remembered all the sleepless nights, the humiliation, and the sacrifices she had thrown away without a second thought. "I'm sorry, Sandra," I said, my voice firm, "but you made your choices, and now you have to live with them. I've moved on." She didn't argue. She just nodded, tears streaming down her face, and walked away. Over the next few weeks, I heard bits and pieces about her life through the grapevine. Alex had skipped town, leaving her to deal with the fallout of his debts. Her friends had abandoned her, afraid of being dragged into the mess. And the creditors I had quietly alerted were relentless. She sold off everything she could, her designer clothes, her jewelry, even the furniture in our house. It wasn't enough. She ended up moving into a small apartment on the outskirts of town, far away from the glamorous life she had once cherished. But the most telling moment came when I ran into one of her former friends at a charity event. The woman leaned in conspiratorially and said, "You know, Sandra's been telling people she wishes she had appreciated you more, that she had been too blind to see what she had." I didn't respond. What was there to say? Sandra's regret wouldn't change what had happened, and it certainly wouldn't fix what she had broken. As I left the event that night, I felt a strange sense of peace. Sandra had built her life on illusions, and when those illusions shattered, so did everything she had worked for. It wasn't my doing. She had done it to herself. I wasn't vindictive, but I wasn't going to save her either. She had burned the bridge between us, and I wasn't about to rebuild it. My focus was on my future, not her past. Walking away from Sandra for the last time felt like the closing of a heavy, creaking door, a door that had kept me trapped in darkness for years. For the first time, I felt the fresh air of freedom, untainted by her manipulations or the weight of her expectations. It wasn't just about leaving her behind. It was about finding myself again. In the days that followed, I threw myself into work, not the endless grind I had once endured to please Sandra, but work that truly mattered to me. I took the money I had safeguarded and invested it in something I had always dreamed of, starting my own business. It wasn't glamorous at first. My office was a small, rented space, and my team consisted of just me and a laptop. But it was mine. Every client I gained, every project I completed, felt like a victory. Slowly, the business grew, and so did I. But it wasn't just about work. I realized I had neglected so many parts of my life while trying to hold my marriage together. I reached out to old friends, people I had drifted away from because Sandra didn't approve of them. One of them, Tony, laughed when I called him. "Man, I thought you were lost forever in Sandra's little kingdom," he joked. "I guess I found my way out," I replied. Tony introduced me to a whole new circle of people, genuine, grounded individuals who didn't care about status or appearances. For the first time in years, I felt like I could be myself without judgment. One of those people was Amara. She wasn't flashy or loud, but there was something about her that drew me in. She was kind, smart, and, most importantly, real. We met at one of Tony's gatherings, and we ended up talking for hours about everything from books to business to life's curveballs. "Victor," she said at one point, "it sounds like you've been through a lot, but it doesn't seem like it broke you. That's rare." Her words stayed with me. Maybe I hadn't realized it before, but she was right. Sandra's betrayal hadn't broken me. It had shaped me, sharpened me, made me stronger. Amara and I started seeing each other more often, though I was careful not to rush into anything. I wasn't looking for someone to fill the void Sandra had left. I wanted something real, something built on mutual respect and trust. And with Amara, it felt like I had finally found that. Meanwhile, my business was flourishing. I hired a small team, moved into a bigger office, and began taking on larger projects. Success wasn't about proving Sandra wrong anymore. It was about proving to myself that I was capable of so much more than she ever believed. One day, I got a call from a local charity organization. They had heard about my business and wanted to know if I'd be interested in sponsoring an event for underprivileged children. Without hesitation, I agreed. At the event, as I watched the kids laughing and playing, I felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was what life was supposed to be about, making a difference, building something meaningful. Toward the end of the event, one of the organizers approached me. "We've been looking for someone to join our board," she said. "Someone with your background and values. Would you consider it?" I was taken aback but also honored. "I'd love to," I replied. That moment felt like a turning point, a full circle moment where everything I had been through, every sacrifice, every heartbreak, had led me to a place of purpose. A few weeks later, as I was clearing out some old boxes, I found Sandra's wedding ring. I had forgotten about it, tucked away in a drawer and collecting dust. I held it in my hand for a moment, turning it over, feeling its weight. It didn't feel heavy anymore. I drove to a pawn shop and sold it. The money wasn't much, but it wasn't about that. I used the cash to donate to the charity I had joined. It felt like closing a chapter, finally letting go of the last remnants of a life that no longer belonged to me. As I walked out of the pawn shop, the sun was shining, and I felt lighter than I had in years. My story wasn't one of defeat. It was one of redemption. Months passed, and my life began to feel like my own again. The chaos Sandra brought into my world had subsided, leaving space for something better. Peace, clarity, and purpose. But closure doesn't come neatly tied in a bow. Sometimes, it arrives in pieces. One of those pieces came unexpectedly. I was attending a charity gala, an event I had sponsored through my growing business. It was a celebration of resilience and second chances, something I resonated with deeply. As I mingled with the crowd, a familiar figure caught my eye in the distance. It was Sandra. She looked different. The once glamorous, larger-than-life woman I had known now seemed subdued, almost unrecognizable. Her outfit, though tasteful, lacked the extravagance she used to flaunt. Her hair was neatly tied back, and there was no trace of the air of superiority she once carried. Our eyes met briefly before she turned away, clearly unsure of whether to approach me. I didn't pursue her, deciding instead to focus on the event and the people around me. But later in the evening, she found me by the refreshments table. "Victor," she began hesitantly. "Hi." I nodded. "Sandra." There was an awkward pause before she finally said, "You've done well for yourself. I've heard about your business, your charity work. It's impressive." "Thank you," I replied simply, refusing to let my guard down. She fidgeted with her hands, a far cry from the confident woman who used to command attention at every room she entered. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed to tell you that I see now what I did to you. To us. Her words didn't carry the satisfaction I thought they might. Instead, they felt like the closing of a book I no longer needed to read. "I appreciate that, Sandra," I said, "but I've moved on." Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "I'm glad. You deserve happiness." With that, she walked away, and I felt no anger, no bitterness, just relief. Sandra had been a storm in my life, but storms don't last forever. They clear, and when they do, they leave room for something new to grow. That something new was already blossoming. My business continued to thrive, allowing me to sponsor more charitable events and support causes I cared about. I had also found something I never expected, love, but not the kind that left me drained or doubting myself. Amara had become a steady, supportive presence in my life, and our relationship was built on mutual respect and understanding. One day, as we walked through a local park, Amara stopped and turned to me. "You've come so far, Victor," she said. "Do you ever look back?" I smiled. I used to. But now? Not anymore. The past is where it belongs, behind me. That night, I sat alone in my home office, reflecting on everything. My journey hadn't been easy. I had faced betrayal, humiliation, and heartbreak. But I had also found strength, purpose, and joy. Life had a way of breaking you open, but if you let it, it could also rebuild you into someone stronger. I opened my laptop and wrote a letter, not to Sandra or anyone else, but to myself. A reminder of what I had endured and what I had achieved. Dear Victor, you were never a nobody. You were someone who gave everything for love, and when that love betrayed you, you found yourself. You chose dignity over revenge, growth over bitterness. You're proof that even in the darkest moments, there's a way forward. Never forget where you've been, but always keep your eyes on where you're going. The best is yet to come. Sincerely, Victor. I closed the laptop, feeling lighter than I had in years. My story wasn't one of defeat or revenge. It was one of resilience and redemption. And as I turned off the lights and walked to bed, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't defined by the woman who threw her ring at me or the laughter of her friends. I was defined by the man who walked away and never looked back.